Welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, the fortnightly podcast that explores self-awareness, leader effectiveness, and leadership at all levels. Join me, your host, Nia Thomas, as we talk to today's Knowing Self, Knowing Others guest. Alison Largier, it's absolutely wonderful to have you here. I'm so delighted to speak to you. We haven't spoken for such a long time, but I was thinking about it. We've known each other for over 20 years, which I can't quite believe that time has flown. For all our listeners today, I've got Alison Largier with me here, and Alison has a background in the NHS and a number of roles in the NHS, from clinical to management to very senior management. And I'm so delighted that she's here. But I'm going to hand over to Alison to introduce herself.
Oh, thanks very much, Nia. And I think we've managed to keep in contact over the years, but as you said, quite some time since we've actually worked together. So in terms of my career, I'm at a privileged point, really. I've literally retired in the last 8 weeks after 37 years working in the Welsh NHS system. And as you said, I started my career at 18. I trained as a mental health nurse, and I've had numerous roles throughout that time. Interestingly, I think for part of the discussion that we'll have later on, I was probably quite young and female. And back in the day, that was a bit different than maybe it is now, into my first management role. So when I was reflecting on my career for this, I was about 29 when I had my first general management role outside of mental health services. And then I was a deputy chief exec by about 35. I was actually an interim chief exec at 40, and then took on numerous other director roles in quite big provider organisations after that. I then took a career break quite late in my career to look after my two elderly parents. And when I came back, I was quite clear I didn't want to come back as a director. My daughter was 10 at the time, and I was mindful she'd be going into secondary school, so I didn't want to come back as a director. And I came back as what I would describe really as a middle manager on a part-time basis, a big role. I'm looking after primary care, community hospitals, district nursing. But actually, that role in the last 8 to 9 years of my career was fascinating for this topic. And I'll explain that probably as you ask the questions. But as you said, a very varied career, but starting as a clinician and in mental health, which I think for this topic you'll see I'll reflect on that quite a lot.
How do you define self-awareness?
If I had to put it in the most simplest form, I'd say it's about understanding myself and how my actions impact on others. So that's if I had to put it in the simplest form, but it is way more complex than that. And I think it's about a conscious understanding. And I say that in the context of really being able to look at yourself, really being able to understand your own strengths, your weaknesses, your beliefs, your values, and not superficially, and being able to be honest, really honest, about what you're good at, what you're not so good at, being honest about how you are able to interact with others and how you change the way that you are depending on the situation that you're in. I think you can never underestimate, and especially in a leadership role, but in any role in life, I don't think you can ever underestimate the impact of yourself on other people. So for me, it's really about understanding yourself, but just as importantly, understanding the impact on others. And I'm just going to sort of go back to that mental health training, because as I said, I did my mental health training at 18. I was really naive, as I guess most 18-year-olds are. So to be thrown into the amount of personality tests that you are when you do and I don't know whether that's the same now, but when you were doing mental health nurse training, the amount of personality tests that you did, the amount that you did on self-awareness, because obviously the patients that you're going to work with are very vulnerable, and really anything you say or do really impacts. So I feel that I probably had a lot of not just training, but the opportunity to reflect very early on in my career. And then throughout my career, I've done the usual sort of 360 feedback, done the King's Fund programs and all of those things. But I always refer back to those very, very early years because I think they were really formative in terms of the way that not just in work, actually in life. I am very reflective in terms of impact, and I think it came from my training really.
How interesting that at such an early stage in the world of work that reflection became so very important, because certainly there are other people that I've spoken to that time to reflect is something that they really got to work out within their working life, and it doesn't come as naturally. But I guess when you that becomes a part of what you do so early on, that follows you through your career.
Absolutely. And I specialised in children's mental health services, and having what we called supervision, which to me simply is a space to reflect, was something that you was non-negotiable essentially. You had, a supervision session on a regular basis. And throughout my career with people that have worked with, and I don't particularly want to use the term mentor, but people that I've worked with that have worked with me, and I don't always mean for me, I mean with me. I've tried to build that in. I mean, so for example, the role that I've just left, any direct report to me, we had a session every week. And some of that was about the to-do list, but a lot of that was also about more general, how are things going? How are the relationships with other people? What can I do, especially after COVID, because some people are not based in the same places as they were before. Sometimes you're based in very different places. Some people are doing some work from home. To have a weekly session, if could always try and build that in with people, face to face, just to make sure that people were okay, but not just tick, are we doing what we need to do? And am I doing what I need to do to help you do your job as well? That has followed me through, I think, from those very, very early days.
Do you think that there is a relationship between self-awareness and leader effectiveness?
I think you know my answer to that. It's absolutely, I think it's absolutely essential. I'm not sure that you can be an effective leader without being self-aware. You can lead, whether that's effective is another question. I keep going back to the impact on others because whether we like it or not, if you're in a leadership role, you are in a position of power, and whether that sits right with you or not, with your beliefs, with your values, other people will perceive you in that way. And with power, we know that there are immediately inequalities. And therefore, you have to find a way of ensuring that doesn't become an issue that is going to impact on achieving goals or working within a team. So I think you have to recognize that. You have to recognize that depending on where you are in an organization, just by walking into a room will have an impact on some other people. Going back to my mental health days, I remember if what was then the matron walked into a ward, everybody stood up. You marked that sort of power, if you like. I mean, those things clearly are not how we work today. But if a chief exec walked onto a ward, staff would immediately feel quite anxious about that. So it's about, you have to be very aware of that and how you work with people, and you have to be able to adapt. I've talked to many people about working, my roles have taken me to working with the public, doing public forums, or meeting with a relative around a complaint. So, and then the next minute I might be in Welsh Government having a conversation with one of the ministers. You have to be very aware of the impact of yourself, and you have to be able to listen, fundamentally listen. You have to be able to understand where other people are coming from, and you have to try and find a way that's going to take everybody, you and the individual, you and the team, to a point where, wherever possible, everybody is then moving towards the same goal. That takes quite a lot of holding that mirror up to yourself to see the impact that you're having, the language that you use. God, how many meetings have we sat in and you've watched somebody almost fall asleep or roll their eyes? It's the non-verbals. You really do have to be aware of all of those things if you truly want everybody to be with you on whatever journey that is. It can be any journey. It can be a massive journey, or can be something quite small. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I think that as a leader, you just need to be very, very cognizant of the way that you take people with you.
That's fascinating. And for listeners who might be new to management or new to leadership, you may want to play that back because I think there is a lot of very helpful guidance there about how to really develop your self awareness. Alison, do you think effective leaders can be found at all levels of organisations?
Absolutely. I think I've already reflected on teams, and we have teams at every level of the organisation. And most teams, however small they are, have some sort of leader. Now, some leaders are given that position because obviously they are appointed into a role, a manager or whatever, they're given. But I'm always interested in the unofficial influencers. I'm very, very interested. And the majority of the time, the unofficial influencers are very good and positive. Sometimes the unofficial influencers are the ones that are derailing the issue that's going on. But if we stick with the issue of leaders throughout the whole of the organisation, my point is you don't have to be appointed into a leadership role. I think we often have unofficial influencers, unofficial leaders who are merely very skilled in the way that they lead. They often don't even know that they're leaders. They are good listeners. They are able to confidently speak about what they think and what they believe. Sometimes they're also good at maybe detangling something that maybe somebody else is trying to say and presenting it in a way that they say, yeah, that is what I meant. I've often seen that in maybe large groups of administrative staff. For example, I can think of an office that I worked in that had lots of ladies working in that office, and actually the leader in that office wasn't the official leader in that office, but she was really, really helping supporting the manager in because she was more able sometimes to articulate what the issues were on behalf of some of the other staff. I think sometimes we assume different levels of leadership are about managers or team leaders. They're not always. Sometimes they're about people who've got intuitive skills about how to bring people together and take issues forward. It's really important that we recognise that, and leaders further up organisations find a way of engaging in bringing on all those leaders to ensure that we take people forward wherever they are in an organisation.
Have you rated and reviewed the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast yet? Here are some things people are already saying. I listened to the Sarah Metcalf one, so thought-provoking. In particular, the point towards the end about vulnerability got me thinking about how you must have self-awareness before you can be vulnerable. I'm really enjoying it so far. The scientist in me is really enjoying the set structure and seeing how different people respond to it. I just listened to the first of your podcasts. I thought it was great. You have a very good interviewing style, the topics were very relevant, and the guest speaker was very clear and engaging. Love the take on self awareness, i.e., needing to think about how people will react to you. I don't do that enough, so it really struck me. Such an interesting first episode, and another already live. Every rate and every review helps the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast extend its reach to new listeners. So thank you for your support. Do you think leaders at the most strategic level of organisations have greater self awareness than leaders at other levels of organisations? And I've been dying to ask you this question because you've had exposure to all of those different levels of organisations.
This was an interesting one because obviously I've been those people as well. So
Mhm.
no, I don't think it is always the case. I don't think people higher up an organization with strategic leads are all always more self-aware. In fact, I would probably say the opposite. Sometimes, not always, because you can't, sometimes I think sometimes the further removed you are from, I don't want to say the patient or the clinician, but further removed you are from day-to-day operations, that I think understandably sometimes your drivers are different, so your focus can sometimes be changed by delivery or by government expectations, and I'm not always certain that sometimes people then put the same emphasis, effort, I'm not quite sure what I would call it, into that sort of regular self-reflection. I've already talked about power, whether you feel comfortable with that or not. When you are, a chief exec, an executive director, that comes automatically with that. But it also means that people often don't challenge you. They won't question you. You don't always get the regulation maybe that you would if you are maybe, I don't know, a team leader, when your staff are more happy to say, no, I'm not happy with that. That doesn't happen to the same degree. So I think if you are not exposed to that, I don't know whether people sometimes feel that everything is okay because they're not being challenged to the same degree. So and again, I'm not, I've seen some fantastic, very senior people who were self-aware, and I'm saying this a little about when when I've been in those positions as well. Sometimes you can be driven by different masters, and your goal that day is to meet X target, and you don't take the same amount of time to listen or to understand the impact of maybe something that you've said in a way that maybe you wouldn't normally say it. It can actually also be quite a lonely place to be. So I'm not excusing people at that level of not being self-aware, but I think sometimes maybe because you're not challenged or you're not questioned to the same degree, maybe that impacts on the fact that you think everything is sometimes fine. My argument, however, would be, and it is something that I tried to be aware of when I was in those positions, is actually you need to be even more self-aware because of that position of power, even more all the time. And actually, I think, having been a clinician, I was constantly thinking, I might think I know what we need to do to get us to X, but I don't know whether that's deliverable on the ground. So I need to find a way of asking the people who are going to deliver this. So, and and again, I'm not saying that your best managers, your best leaders have always come through the system and have always been clinicians. I'm not saying that either. But for me, I can only reflect on my personal journey. I never actually lost that reflecting back on. So what would this really mean? So yeah, I can sit. I was a director of planning at one part. I can sit here, I can write as many plans as I like. I can shut myself in a room, come up with an amazing plan. The Welsh Government puts lovely ticks all over, but are we really going to be able to deliver it unless I find a way of engaging all the people that are going to need to deliver on this? I need to test it. I need people's views. I really need to think about how I present this. Please don't present anything as a fait accompli. Do not. The rule is do not sit in a room and write a plan without anybody. Engage everybody along the way. Be prepared to change things based on other people's, because it won't happen unless you take people with you. And I think that sort of self-awareness at that level of I might be in this position and I might have amazing skills, because we've got to remember that often people have got exceptional skills at doing that sort of thing, but actually without involving everybody else, without taking that feedback, without watching how it's received, without being aware of the way that you present something, without engaging your partners, your local authority colleagues, your local councillors, and changing the way that you present things, not using the same language as you would in the without doing all of that at that very strategic level. There's often a unspoken conflict is the word that I think I'd use. That sort of language that is them and us.
Yeah.
They don't know, they don't understand, and that can create quite a lot of barriers if, as a strategic leader, you're not seeing that. And that, I think, for me, that's a lot of the self-awareness. Not long before I left, somebody was talking about a colleague, and they used the term, and it really hit me. Said the smiling assassin. And I
Interesting
thought,
term.
wow. And they said, and it made me think about behaviours and how you present yourself. And they said, oh no, this person can give you the worst information, or can really be telling you off, but with a massive smile on their face. So this sort of incongruence. And I thought, if you want to be good at what you do, anything like that, you'll start thinking, how do I present that sort of information? What do I do in that situation? Because it really is about constantly learning, I think, when you're in those positions. But I do think there can be an incongruence sometimes between that very strategic senior management and people lower down in the organisation in that sense. And I felt that quite acutely in my last role, I think. So having been executive director, having been a chief exec, and then coming back for that last part of my career as a middle manager, I think there was a bit of inevitability that I would feel frustrated on times,
Yeah.
because I wasn't able to influence as much as I had been able to previously. So I get that bit. But that sort of hierarchical, somebody two places above me had to go to a meeting because that's where they were in the organisation compared to the person in the local authority, for example. But then the person from the local authority would say, why isn't Alison here? Because she's the one who knows what we're talking about. And then after the meeting would ring me and say, I didn't understand any of that. What are we doing now? It's that sort of recognizing that, again, in these positions, sometimes we just got to use the right person for the job. It doesn't really matter where you are in an organization. If somebody's got the skill for X, then brilliant. It doesn't matter where they are, use them for that. So it's an interesting one, because I think there are also really good leaders out there, not in strategic sort of positions. I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush, but I think things can change, and I think you have to be even more self-aware, but sometimes I'm not sure we always are.
That's very interesting. And I don't suppose I expected so many of my interviewees to say that. So part of my research, that there's a real body of research that talks about self-awareness and leadership, referred to as the self-other rating studies. And they say that strategic leaders are the most self-aware, etc., etc. They use slightly different research methods than I did. But my research said the exact opposite, which is what you have been saying and what all of my interviewees have been saying. And that, again, incongruous information that I'm gathering from the literature and from people who are actually working in the world of work right now is fascinating, and is quite worrying, I suppose, in that general view of strategic leaders is that self-awareness is lacking. Do you think effective leaders have more self-awareness than ineffective leaders?
Yes is the easy answer. I don't think you can be an effective leader without being self-aware. So for me, they definitely go hand in hand. You have to be able to understand the impact of your words, your behaviour, your actions, to be able to mobilise a team to deliver on any sort of strategic goal or local operational goal. It doesn't matter what it is. I think you have to be able to do that. Otherwise, you either won't get there, whatever the there is. It'll take you 10 times longer, or you will get there, but you'll have lots of unhappy people within a team.
And that's one of the things I was thinking about. What, in your experience, do leaders who are less self-aware, what does that look like in the world of work? How does that manifest? Have you had that experience? Have you watched it? Have you lived it?
Absolutely. So you can get to an end goal without that, but generally it takes much longer. You will have unhappy people because you haven't taken. Don't get me wrong. You'll always have some unhappy people. It doesn't matter how much you do, because we don't fundamentally in life all believe the same things. So you're always going to have some people, but you work with engaging people as much as you possibly can. And I spoke to somebody who said, oh, all this self-awareness stuff, all this sort of wishy-washy, and people never make decisions if they it's not that at all. In fact, I think people who are self-aware are probably more confident in making decisions, but they try wherever they possibly can to take everybody with them so that it's a joint decision. That can sometimes take a little bit longer, but actually then the delivery usually takes a shorter period of time. I've also been in positions whereby I'm going to have to make a decision. I am going to have to go in a certain direction that other people really don't like, and sometimes that's because it's been dictated to me. But again, I just think if you would first tell people, you get to that position and you explain why we got to make that, why we have to make that change, what the implications will be if we don't make the change. It's okay sometimes to say, I sort of agree with you. I don't agree we should do all of this, but this is the way it's that sort of empathy as well. So it's not, being self-aware is not about not making decisions, taking forever to. The other thing is, oh, it'll take you forever to take everybody with you. Well, it might take me a bit longer to get, but then we'll go for it. There's lots of programs that instill very, very strict timescales around things, very specific programs of work. And I just think sometimes you've just got to, you got to find a way of engaging with the most relevant people and taking them with you, whatever that takes. Because if you don't, then there will always be people who feel very disengaged. And my last point on this is, I constantly say to people, what's the impact on this for the patient? But also, what will the impact of this be on the staff? And I'm not sure we sometimes ask those questions enough. I think being self-aware is not about being wishy-washy and not making decisions. It's about how you do it.
Alison, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I'm so glad we had this opportunity to get together, and I hope it doesn't take us this long to have another conversation. As ever, I've learned a lot from you today. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have. Alison Lagier, once again, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Nia.
Thank you for joining me, your host, Nia Thomas, at the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. If you'd like to know more about self-awareness, leader effectiveness, and leadership at all levels, please take a look at my website, knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. You can also join me on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Make sure you bookmark the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast and tune into the next episode in 2 weeks' time. I look forward to having you on my learning journey. If you'd like to join me as a guest on the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, please drop me a line at info@knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. If you'd like to advertise your podcast, book, or company connected to self-awareness, leader effectiveness, or leadership at all levels, please drop me a line at the same email. Please remember to bookmark the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast so that you can keep up to date with all new episodes. Remember to rate this podcast on whichever directory you listen. Knowing Self, Knowing Others is available to listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Index, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Pocket Casts, Deezer, Listen Notes, Player FM, Overcast, Castro,